Yes. So I hope you can all see it well and that you can all hear me. Greek Byzantine apocalyptic literature has long been a largely unexplored and understudied field. Byzantine eschatological ideas used to be mainly investigated on the basis of theological writings or liturgical texts such as hymnography. The popular ideas relating to the afterlife that circulated through writings of an apocalyptic or visionary character remain neglected by modern scholarship. Following statement by Leonard Riden reflects the common view of Byzantine scholars of the genre. Byzantine apocalypses tend to be fairly simple-minded documents. True, they are made up to a large extent of topoi deriving from the eschatological tradition, yet each one of them reflects the fears and aspirations of the time of its composition, as I'm going to argue here. Significantly, one of the main questions which has hardly been investigated with regard to this body of literature is how far and in which ways those texts form part of a long Jewish and Christian apocalyptic and eschatological tradition. Notably, Alexander Golitsyn observed certain common themes between the Byzantine visionary literature and the Jewish Merkaba tradition, as well as the Hekkalot literature. He stressed the interiorization of the ascent to heaven and other motifs from Second Temple and early Christian apocalypses. The official theology of the Byzantine Empire has naturally influenced the formation of eschatological beliefs. As is well known, however, even if the production and dissemination of esoteric literature was frowned upon by the church authorities, pseudepigraphical literature continued to be copied, translated, and expanded upon in monastic scriptoria, and most notably in those in the periphery of the empire. According to a widespread scholarly opinion, the Byzantine times are characterized by a relative lack of interest in writings relating to the afterlife and heavenly journeys. Indeed, although political apocalyptic texts, which were based mainly on the Book of Daniel and dealt with the political fate of the empire, circulated in multiple copies and versions, texts that were concerned with the fate of the souls after death seem to have existed rather marginally. Therefore, these writings are few in number and possibly also of relatively limited popularity. Significantly, descriptions of eschatological visions are often integrated into hagiographical literature of the time as part of out-of-body or after-death experiences of holy men and women, monks and nuns, or their novices and righteous people in general. The hell and paradise stores often also include a vision of the divine throne. The descriptions of afterlife which were included in the hagiographical literature marked a shift with respect to the attribution of authority of the visionaries. The traditional revelatory figures of the earlier Jewish and Christian apocalyptic traditions, such as biblical patriarchs, become obsolete, and even New Testament and apostolic authorities are viewed as distant figures of the past. The center of the attention is occupied almost exclusively by the figure of the holy man or holy woman, so monks, nuns. This shift becomes the norm for the Byzantine literature that seeks to transmit theoretical but also practical otherworldly knowledge to its clerical or non-clerical audience. Furthermore, these writings demonstrate typical features of the literature of the time and reflect contemporary Byzantine popular views on life after death. In this regard, they represent valuable witnesses of their period and culture. However, it is important to note that the homogeneous tradition of eschatological views and motives cannot be claimed in the context of Byzantine literature. Significantly, the body of texts which deal with afterlife visions and narratives demonstrate a disproportionate interest in visions of hell punishments. The interest in ideas about paradise is relatively limited. It appears that the horrifying, hair-raising descriptions of hell punishments were considered to be more interesting and urgent because of their moralizing intentionality for the broad public compared to the positive, or at least superficially optimistic ideas of rewards promised in the afterlife for the very few righteous. Descriptions of paradise can be found in a number of Byzantine texts that recount visionary experiences. A short description of paradise is included, for example, in one version of the Apocalypse of the Virgin Mary. As Richard Bockham characteristically remarks, in most manuscripts, the Greek Apocalypse of Virgin consists only of a tour of hell, though in some, a brief visit to paradise, is appended. A longer description can be found in the 10th century text known as the Apocalypse of Anastasia. It is important to note that these texts rely heavily on older apocalyptic texts, and most notably on the Apocalypse of Paul. In certain aspects, texts such as the Apocalypse of the Virgin Mary and the Apocalypse of Anastasia can be regarded as medieval rewritings or expansions of these most popular Christian apocalyptic texts of late antiquity. Even if the popularity of the Apocalypse of Paul is well documented both in Eastern and Western Christianity, questions of textual dependence or intertextuality between older pseudepigrapha and later literature have hardly been considered so far. In this context, I would like to explore the question of the pseudepigraphic transmission in Byzantine times, and more specifically suggest some possible influences of Jewish and Christian apocalyptic literature on Byzantine texts. This analysis will only deal with a few motives to show their possible connection with the earlier pseudepigraphic literature. In this sense, it does not claim to be exhaustive. Rather, it represents an attempt to offer a contribution to the discussion of this tradition based on the descriptions of paradise. As already mentioned, descriptions of paradise can be found in several Byzantine texts that deal mainly with visionary experiences. Detailed narratives are integrated in hagiographical texts such as the life of Andrew the Fool and the life of St. Basil the Younger. Leonard Riden commented that the lives of Basil and Andrew are fascinated by apocalypses to such an extent that they almost appear to be pretexts for writing apocalyptic fiction and for lengthy, complicated eschatological digressions. The mentioned texts are approximately dated to the 10th century. This dating confirms a newly discovered interest in apocalyptic prophecies around the 10th century in Byzantium. Robert Kraft maintained that the period around the year 1000 seems to have witnessed a rise in apocalyptic expectations in Christian circles, but the detailed story remains to be written. Ideas about the coming of the end of the world, the Last Judgment, heaven and hell, seem to have been particularly popular around that period. It is an era when the Byzantine world appears to discover a new apocalypticism and eschatology. As Paul Magdaleno remarks, the very existence of this text is important as confirmation that speculation about the afterlife was intense during the 10th century, when apocalyptic expectations ran high with the advent of the middle of the 7th millennium since the creation of the world. In the following, I'm going to discuss the paradise visions narrated in the life of Andrew the Fool, as I would like to demonstrate complicated and at times rambling Byzantine hagiographical texts, such as the life of Andrew, preserve, recycle, and transmit various established apocalyptic motifs already documented in the early Jewish apocalyptic tradition and also in early Christian apocalyptic texts. Thus, these texts bear evidence to the longevity, popularity, and preservation of this vivid tradition through various trajectories, languages, and cultural contexts. Furthermore, they suggest that the apocalyptic tradition, as preserved, developed, and documented in later writings, demonstrates a deeply conservative character regarding the choice of main structural elements and motives integrated in the respective narratives. The particular narrative frame set the scenery and serve mainly as cultural indicators, but they rarely ever significantly modify the major apocalyptic elements used. The life of Andrew the Fool, a fool of God, was composed by his disciple Nikephoros and takes place in a fictive context in Constantinople of the 6th century. However, as already indicated, the text stems most probably from the 10th century. The life is witnessed in over 100 Greek manuscripts from the 11th to the 19th century. Stephanos Epithemiadis notes that it is a text with a remarkably wide circulation, as it survives in whole or in part in some 90 codices, and its popularity extended to the Slav world. The life presents a very complex and comprehensive work of an almost encyclopedic character. The text narrates two visions of paradise. The first vision refers to Andrew's visit to paradise when he was seriously ill and went through a near-death experience during a terrible winter storm in Constantinople. Shortly before Andrew freezes to death, he sees a handsome young man coming over to him whose face shines like the sun. He greets Andrew with a bunch of golden flowers. A voice orders that Andrew should be transferred to a quiet place for 2 weeks. Immediately, Andrew finds himself in a wonderful garden. He realizes that he's transferred to this garden without his body. However, even if he does not have a material body, he is dressed with a dazzling garment, white as snow, set with precious stones and a marvelously red girdle. He also has a golden floweret and sandals on. Thus, he is properly dressed for his visit to heaven. In the garden, Andrew marvels at the beautiful evergreen trees dripping honey that appear like the crystal of heaven. Wonderful birds with wings like gold or snow sit on these trees. A mighty river flows through the garden and irrigates it. A grapevine full with heavy grapes and golden leaves leans over the river like a lamp. This lamp is identified with Christ, the cornerstone. Four winds blow in paradise and spread beautiful odors and colors. Andrew falls in ecstasy and finds himself on the firmament, where he meets again the handsome young man who now becomes his guide in heaven. Andrew starts a heavenly journey to the throne of God, passing through 3 firmaments. On the first firmament of heaven, they see a cross and 4 shining curtains and innumerable magnificent-looking singers. Their eyes shine like fire as they sing a hymn in honor of the crucified one. The second firmament appears like snow, and there are 2 crosses there in a fiery surrounding. The third firmament looks like a golden leaf and has 3 crosses, also surrounded by fire. Innumerable heavenly hosts praise God. Andrew and his guide pass through splendid curtains until they reach the throne of God that hangs in the air without support. Andrew sees there the Son of Man, Jesus Christ, clad in shining purple and linen. Andrew descends then from the heavens and finds himself again in a wonderful fragrant flower garden with a well where from milk and honey spring. He encounters the dazzling man dressed in a garment like a shining cloud who holds a cross and explains why Andrew, the fool of God, was worthy of a vision of God and a vision of paradise. The man is presumably the good thief. Andrew's vision of paradise as a lavish, marvelous garden reveals the future reward of the righteous in a spiritual way. However, the garden is still empty. The heavenly journey of Andrew borrows several common eschatological motifs, but also demonstrates certain original elements, such as the presence of the crosses on the various heavens and the veneration by Andrew and his guides. The presence of the good thief as a revelatory figure is an additional original trait of the Apocalypse. His presence in this context emphasizes even more strongly the importance of the crucifixion motive for the text. The vision of the throne of the Son of Man is described in its full imperial glory. It is assumed that such representations in visionary Byzantine literature were inspired by the symbolism and ritualism of the Byzantine imperial court. Jane Bond even suggests that the Byzantine representations of the heavenly world were transformed in order to match the model of the Byzantine imperial court. As she further remarks, the transformation is most striking in Andrew the Fool's otherworld vision, which reads like a celestial de ceremonies and in fact mirrors Euthred of Cremona's famous audience before Constantine VII, the Porphyrogenitus. Andrew progresses through the various gardens filled with marvelous birds, real-life versions of the Pallas Automata and forecourts of the heavens like a highly favored diplomat through the imperial palace. He witnesses theatrical display of treasures and wonders and singers shouting holy acclamations. All the wonders, including Jesus himself, are located behind huge curtains of fine linen and purple. Similarly, Philip Alexander had also stressed that there is no ontological discontinuity between earth and heaven. Both belong, so to speak, to the same space-time continuum. However, it should be noted that there is a long tradition of descriptions of the divine throne in which the limits between heavenly and earthly reality are often fluid. Heaven and the divine throne were often envisioned in terms of a royal court and in general. So this is not necessarily a very specific Byzantine characteristic, even if it mirrors Byzantine court imagery, at least up to a point. The second heavenly vision in the life of Andrew is attributed to his disciple Epiphanius. Epiphanius wishes to receive a vision of Andrew in heaven. He sees in dream how an old man visits him. The man holds a gospel and a papyrus scroll and leads Epiphanius to paradise. According to iconographic and legendary traditions, the old man might represent John the Evangelist, who was also identified with John of Revelation. Notably, Epiphanius does not receive a youthful person as a guide. In that sense, he does not have an angelic escort, but an older man, reflecting thus perhaps in this way his own status as a novice. Together they reach a court full of light, in which there is Pallas, built of a solar breeze. They further walk through a hall full of strange and incredible mysteries and fiery thrones. On one of the thrones, which rises to an immense height, he sees an awe-inspiring and ineffable king shining like the sun, while bolts of fire proceed from his face, so that the ether itself is illuminated by an abundance of glory and brilliance. Around him there are innumerable legions and armies of cherubim, seraphim, and powers. The king allows Epiphanius to enter the kingdom of heaven, reserved for the saints, a chamber full of light. In this chamber there sits Andrew in full glory. Epiphanius wakes up and realizes that he has seen a vision of Jesus Christ as the king. This short vision clearly demonstrates basic differences to Andrew's vision. Epiphanius is directly translated to the divine throne. The divine residence is described quite precisely like a royal palace. Despite his awesome appearance, Jesus Christ appears approachable and merciful. Epiphanius is allowed to see the saints in the kingdom of heavens, which is described like a chamber of light. As observed, Andrew experiences paradise as a luscious garden. Separate elements in the description of the Garden of Paradise recall motifs that are already evident in other apocalyptic texts. Andrew stresses in the text repeatedly the fragrance of paradise, a motif that corresponds to a well-known and established motif. Springs of milk and honey in paradise are also mentioned quite similarly, described in 2nd Enoch. Moreover, they also relate to the rivers of honey and milk in the Apocalypse of Paul. Luscious trees in the garden also present a very common apocalyptic image. Andrew needs to ascend to the heavens before he can reach the throne. The paradise is located on the 3rd heaven, as in 2nd Enoch. The motif of the golden 3rd heaven also recalls the Apocalypse of Paul, in which the 3rd heaven is described as a golden gate with golden columns. Each firmament has a different appearance and represents a gradual ascent, since in the 1st heaven there is 1 cross, in the 2nd heaven 2 crosses, in the 3rd heaven 3 crosses. Already before the first cross, there are wonderful curtains and angel choirs which highlight the holiness of the place. These curtains in front of the crosses possibly represent the arrangement and design of Byzantine church altars, with which the author must have been familiar through his everyday liturgical experience. The 3rd curtain, which hides the throne of the Son of Man, looks purple and linen, similar to the curtain of the Temple of Jerusalem. Jesus is also clad in the priestly imperial garments of purple and linen. The 3 crosses that represent the forecourt to the throne court are surrounded by fire in accordance with common apocalyptic images. The idea of the fiery throne of the Son of Man is a topos indeed in apocalyptic literature. Similarly, the fiery palaces in the vision of Epiphanius recall 1st Enoch, in which Enoch passes through fiery marble houses until he reaches a fiery throne. 2nd Enoch and also the life of Adam and Eve mention, similar to Epiphanius, the burning face of God emitting sparks. The description of God's throne as flashing fire bears strong similarities to Andrew's fiery heaven. The paradise garden is totally empty in the life of Andrew. Similarly, the paradise is not inhabited, for example, in 1st Enoch 32 and in 2nd Enoch 8 following. It is also interesting to note that Andrew receives a vision of paradise while he is still alive. In certain terms, the paradise that awaits him is shown to him in advance, which is actually also a very common motif in the martyrological literature. In certain terms, the paradise that awaits him is shown to him in advance. Yeah? The golden bunch of flowers, the beginning of the paradise story of the life of Andrew the Fool, most possibly represents the good deeds of Andrew and could be understood as a symbol of his righteousness. However, Andrew does not meet the souls of the righteous in paradise. Even if he is considered one of the righteous, he does not yet belong there, since he's still alive, really. Furthermore, the transformation of Andrew corresponds to the typical motif of the rapture of the visionary in apocalyptic literature. Enoch, in 2nd Enoch 22, is clad with the garments of divine glory and is transformed accordingly into an angel-like figure. Andrew is also transformed in an ideal way shortly before his upcoming trip to the heavens, and only then is he ready to enter the garden of God. The author recites common angelic imagery, which would have easily been recognizable by his audience, even if they were not familiar with apocalyptic literature and ideas. The description of the garments of Andrew refers to iconographic depictions of angels from Byzantine times that might have been inspired by the Book of Daniel or other biblical and parabiblical traditions. Similar images can further be found in texts such as 2nd Enoch 1 that describe gigantic men with faces like shining suns, eyes like burning lamps, and hands white as snow. Special emphasis is put on the description of the angels, although they are rarely called angels, but rather handsome young men, who are distinguished through their glorious garments and magnificent appearance. The stereotypical depiction of the angels as guides and assistants during the heavenly tours follows standard apocalyptic motifs. Their physical appearance also reflects older pseudepigraphical traditions. However, their precise physical description seems to have been inspired by Byzantine culture and art, and more specifically Byzantine iconography. Angelic garments were commonly colored white in Byzantine icons as a symbol of spiritual purity and transcendence. Furthermore, a number of scholars have argued that the angels imagined as gloriously dressed youths bring to mind court eunuchs. As Ringrose in her study of Byzantine eunuchs maintains, the correspondence refers to the imagined parallels of divine and imperial courts and the use of white robes. It is not hard to see why eunuchs were mistaken for angels. In the Vita of St. Simeon the Stylite the Younger, for example, Simeon has a vision that includes a corps of angel-like men who were eunuchs whose clothing was white as snow. However, especially after the 6th century, it was also common for the angels and archangels to be depicted in imperial dress and in the colors red, violet, or blue and purple colors that were specially assigned to the imperial court officers. And actually on the slide, you can see a little bit these colors of the dress of the angels. In contrast to Andrew's at least partly bucolic vision, Epiphanius' otherworldly vision bears almost urban features. His out-of-body experience takes place exclusively in closed spaces. The throne vision is located in a palace where Epiphanius proceeds through fiery halls. The heavenly kingdom is depicted like a chamber of light. The symbol of fire as a medium to describe a theophanic experience is prominent in both visions. It is striking, however, that Epiphanius does not have a vision of the Garden of Paradise. The difference in the experiences and in the description probably depends on the distinction of a spiritual character between the two protagonists. Epiphanius, as a novice of Andrew, is granted only a brief audience before the throne in the palace of the king, so that his wish to see Andrew's transcendent persona in heaven would be fulfilled. It is possible that the author stressed the difference between the two visions in order to demonstrate the spiritual difference between the master and the novice. Andrew experiences a more esoteric vision due to his spiritual maturity and superiority. He witnesses a genuine heavenly ascent and partakes in the divine secrets. Epiphanius' vision has the sole intention of showing a glimpse of Andrew's glory. Only in this context does Epiphanius also receive a brief insight into the mercy of Jesus Christ, who grants him a transcendent vision of Andrew. In both versions, the visions can only take place after spoken permissions that are understood as special gifts of the divine grace. The double paradise narrative with their different characteristics is a unique feature of these hagiographical texts. The paradise vision of the novice clearly stresses the blessed, elevated status of the master and indirectly confirms his visionary authority. Thus, it provides a very helpful literary device that transforms the hagiographic text into an apocalyptic narrative. As Paul Magdalene notes about his literature, the visions and the edifying messages occupy so much space that the lives can easily be seen as framed stories of set pieces of apocalyptic exegesis in which the saints themselves are of secondary importance. Accordingly, we observe that heavenly ascents and audiences in front of the throne of God, commonly located on the third heaven, become part of the hagiographic literature. The monks and nuns or fools of God in our texts all visit the throne of God, evidence of their closeness to God in this life. Main motifs are also shared with other contemporaneous texts that describe paradise. The motifs of the paradise, as the beautiful walled garden of Abraham's bosom and of the banquet for the merciful, are also attested in the Apocalypse of Anastasia. As already noted, the description of paradise is influenced by several older motifs and traditions. However, as Jane Bone also notes, paradise as a walled garden of indescribable fertility and beauty is common in dreams, visions, edifying tales, and Byzantine Last Judgment iconography. Similar descriptions can also be found in works such as the Life of Philaretus, The Merciful by Nicetas, and in the Funerary Oration by mighty Psellos to his daughter Styliani. So I do mention this text here in case that you would like to look up further literature. The 10th century vision of the monk Cosmas, a former imperial chamberlain, is the only other extensive Middle Byzantine near-death narrative. Cosmas' relaxed al fresco heaven includes Abraham in the world of the blessed, the heavenly city in the banquet of the righteous. According to Christina Angelidi, Cosmas recognized everything he saw in the other world, either because it was so similar to the imperial palace or because it looked just like an icon. This text can be regarded as more or less elaborate variations of major apocalyptic themes. However, the apocalyptic elements were integrated into hagiographical literature and as such achieved a more mainstream status that facilitated their broader acceptance and circulation. Moreover, these texts were also deeply rooted in the canonical church tradition. The eschatological narratives integrated various elements which were familiar from the Byzantine literature and iconography as well, thus they merged various traditions both from the contemporary religious culture and older pseudepigraphical literary traditions. The Byzantine visionary literature indicates that non-canonical texts were further copied, read, and discussed, and even served as inspiration sources for the production of new or original literature in Byzantium. Evelyn Patlajan noted that these works constitute narrative justifications of representations of the afterlife according to the normative theological system. The descriptions of the afterlife provide answers to questions about Byzantine eschatological beliefs of the time. These variations on a theme emerged during a cultural period that follows the iconoclastic crisis in the middle of the 9th century and lasts until the decline of the ruling Macedonian, also known as Armenian dynasty, that is in 1025. The historical context is thus related to the aftermath of the iconoclastic crisis that triggered an important cultural innovation in all the fields of literary and scholarly production in Byzantium through new editions of ancient works, compilations of encyclopedias, and the renewal of the imperial legislation. In other words, the Greek Byzantine literature of the 10th century appears to reflect the evolution of the apocalyptic genre and its accommodation with the broader culture and with its specific cultural, religious, and literary needs. Apocalyptic ideas become readapted and integrated into the Byzantine world and also reflect specific developments in Byzantine history. Pseudepigrapha and apocalyptic literature are often viewed as marginal literary genres that led an obscure life in dark corners of the libraries of remote monasteries. However, these texts survived not only due to the efforts of perhaps few curious librarians and monks, they obviously also survived because they filled a vacuum regarding popular questions about death and afterlife. Furthermore, this textual legacy in the garb of hagiography would appeal to both learned religious specialists and the largely illiterate common believers. Greek Byzantine apocalyptic literature reflects a stage in the history of apocalyptic literature in which motifs, which can be more or less easily traced back to famous Jewish and Christian apocalyptic texts, were interiorized and also became integrated in other literary genres. Thus, it is no longer possible to claim a direct textual dependence, even if we can imagine that the authors might have made eclectic use of various texts available in monastic libraries. Finally, even if largely neglected by modern scholarship, accounts of heavenly journeys from 10th century Constantinople are important witnesses for the development of apocalyptic and eschatological literature in Greek language, as well as for the development of Byzantine popular religious literature. So thank you very much. I hope that wasn't too tiring. I see there is a lot of comments in the chat that I didn't